75 founding signatures on a campaign ledger represent more than just a coalition. They are a strategic consolidation of the most influential voting bloc in the state of Maine.
Janet Mills also making a campaign stop in Portland today for her race for Senate. Mills launching a new coalition. Janet Mills also making a campaign stop in Portland today for her race for Senate. Mills launching a new coalition called Women for Janet. She talked about how women's rights are at risk, alluding to Graham Plattner's deleted Reddit posts and tattoos. She also mentioned Susan Collins' vote to confirm Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court.
And when she ran last time, 6 years ago, we knew about that vote, but we didn't know about the Dobbs decision because of her vote, her critical vote on Kavanaugh, that women across this country, about a third of all women lack reproductive health care.
At the time of the vote on Kavanaugh, Senator Collins wrote that protecting abortion rights were important to her and that Kavanaugh had expressed following precedent was a fundamental part of the judicial process. Senate primary elections will be held on June 9th.
While the opposition remains mired in the toxic waste of deleted social media posts and controversial tattoos, the incumbents' past judicial votes have officially moved from the legacy column to the current liability column. We are auditing a scenario where constitutional precedent was sold as a guaranteed asset, but resulted in a total liquidation of reproductive rights for 1/3 of the nation. This is the moment where the political market determines if a proven executive can leverage a Women for Janet portfolio to bankrupt a 24-year incumbency built on broken promises. I am Camilo Motado, and this is Camilo's House. As a certified public accountant focused on forensic verification, I approach every campaign launch like a high-stakes merger where the intangible assets of trust and rights are being weighed against the hard liabilities of a legislative record. In a standard audit, we look for significant deficiencies in how a firm manages its core mission. But today we are performing a forensic campaign audit on Governor Janet Mills' latest strategic expansion. We are documenting the launch of Women for Janet, a coalition of 75 founding members from across the state, designed to act as a security buffer against the rising volatility of the 2026 Senate race. We are analyzing a material discrepancy between the 2018 assurances of Senator Susan Collins and the 2026 reality of healthcare access, a reporting error that Mills is now using to trigger a hostile takeover of the Maine Senate seat. The operational launch at Coffee by Design in Portland wasn't just a photo opportunity. It was a targeted acquisition of the female electorate. In any professional audit, the strength of the board determines the solvency of the venture. By assembling 75 luminaries from across the state, Mills is de-risking her primary campaign against Graham Plattner. She is now deploying against a seasoned competitor whose primary selling point of moderate stability has suffered a systemic collapse. We have to audit the toxic assets currently held by Mills' primary opponent, Graham Plattner. As we move closer to the June 9th Democratic primary, Plattner's portfolio is being weighed down by negative equity stemming from deleted social media posts and what Mills describes as a controversial tattoo. In the world of reputational auditing, a deleted post is an unrecorded liability that eventually gets recovered by the competition. Mills is using these audit findings to suggest that Plattner is a high-risk investment for the Democratic Party, a candidate whose internal controls on his own public image are functionally bankrupt. By contrast, she is positioning herself as the stable value fund, a candidate whose disclosure statements have been public for decades and who doesn't require a risk mitigation strategy for her past digital behavior. The most significant operational risk in this audit involves the legacy of Senator Susan Collins and her 2018 contractual agreement with the voters of Maine. During the launch of her coalition, Mills directly addressed Collins' vote to confirm Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. From a forensic perspective, this was a material transaction that changed the legal landscape of the entire country. In 2018, Collins justified her vote by auditing Kavanaugh's commitment to precedent. She stated that he believed precedent was not just a policy, but constitutionally dictated under Article 3. She assured her shareholders that protecting reproductive rights was important to her and that Kavanaugh viewed Roe v. Wade as a settled tenet. However, the 2022 Dobbs decision acted as a systemic default on those assurances. Mills is now performing a post-mortem audit on that vote, arguing that because of Collins' critical support, 1/3 of all women in the country now lack access to reproductive health care. This breach of precedent is the primary impairment on Susan Collins' 2026 balance sheet. In accounting terms, Collins sold the public a warranty on the Supreme Court that proved to be non-binding. She relied on the goodwill of a nominee who eventually liquidated the very precedent she claimed he would protect. For a forensic auditor like Mills, this is a smoking gun of management failure. She is arguing that Collins didn't perform the due diligence required of a senior senator, or worse, that she willfully misrepresented the risk profile of the Kavanaugh nomination to her constituents. The Dobbs decision isn't just a judicial ruling in this audit. It is a material event that has created a healthcare deficit that Mills intends to refinance through federal legislation. We must also look at the market sentiment of the Portland stop. Launching a women's coalition in a coffee shop known for its community ties is a micro-targeting strategy designed to build organic equity. Mills isn't just speaking to the 75 founding members. She is speaking to the future cash flows of the Democratic base, the younger voters, and suburban women who are currently undecided or risk-averse. By focusing on the controversial tattoo of Graham Plattner and the judicial vote of Susan Collins, Mills is bracketing the competition. She is telling the voters as auditors that the primary opponent is too unstable and the general opponent is too complicit. This leaves Mills as the only liquid asset in the race, the only candidate who can close the deal without a default on her core values. The Article 3 argument used by Collins in 2018 is a classic example of legalistic accounting. She tried to frame Kavanaugh's judicial philosophy as a structural asset that was rooted in the Constitution. She claimed that paying heed to precedent was constitutionally dictated. As a CPA, I track the consistency of application. If an auditor tells you a tenet must be followed except in extraordinary circumstances, you have to audit what constitutes an extraordinary circumstance. For the Supreme Court, the existence of a right for 50 years was apparently not extraordinary enough to prevent its liquidation. Collins' audit report on Kavanaugh was statistically inaccurate, and the social cost of that error is now the primary liability of her campaign. Mills is effectively filing a lawsuit in the court of public opinion, asking the voters to rescind Collins' contract for failure to disclose the true risks of her judicial appointments. The timeline of this disclosure is critical. Mills noted that in 2020, we knew about the Kavanaugh vote, but we didn't know the outcome of the Dobbs decision. In professional auditing, we call this subsequent events. A subsequent event is something that happens after the balance sheet date, but before the audit report is finalized that provides additional evidence of conditions that existed. The Dobbs decision is the subsequent event that provides irrefutable evidence that Collins' 2018 audit of Kavanaugh was a failure of internal controls. Mills is arguing that while Collins might have been given a pass in 2020, the data is now final. The healthcare deficit is real, the rights have been liquidated, and the responsibility rests on the desk of the senator who provided the critical vote. We must also audit the operating environment of the June 9th primary. Graham Plattner is attempting to run as a disruptor asset, an oyster farmer who represents a worker-led revolution. But in a high-risk market where reproductive rights are on the negotiation table, disruption is often viewed as a volatility risk. Mills is betting that the voter stakeholders will prefer a proven executive who knows how to manage a statewide ledger over an unproven outsider who is already spending his political capital defending his social media history. By launching Women for Janet now, Mills is performing a hostile takeover of the narrative before Plattner can market his own alternative portfolio. She is saturating the exchange with her brand equity as a defender of rights, leaving very little market share for Plattner to occupy. The final reconciliation of the Portland launch shows an administration that is fully leveraged on the issue of women's rights. This isn't a minor line item in Mills' campaign. It is the core business model. By linking the deleted posts of the primary opponent to the Supreme Court vote of the general opponent, Mills is creating a consolidated audit of accountability. She is arguing that any management team that minimizes or liquidates these rights is insolvent and unfit to lead Maine in the U.S. Senate. Her investment thesis is simple. Experience plus consistency equals a positive return for the voter. My forensic verdict on the launch of Women for Janet is that Governor Janet Mills has successfully diversified her campaign against the systemic risks of her opponents. She has identified a material breach of trust in Susan Collins' record and a material weakness in Graham Plattner's character. By capitalizing on the Dobbs default, Mills is positioning herself as the guarantor of rights in a market that is desperate for regulatory stability. The 75 founding members are just the beginning of what looks like a massive capital inflow of support that will be very difficult for a distressed incumbent or an unproven challenger to offset. I want to hear from you. Does this subsequent event of the Dobbs decision permanently impair the trust asset of Susan Collins, or can she restructure her narrative before November? Is a proven executive like Janet Mills a safer investment for Maine than a disruptor like Graham Plattner? Let me know in the comments. Your perspective is the only audit that matters when the future of constitutional precedent is sitting on the balance sheet of the Maine Senate race. I am Camilo Motado, and this is Camilo's House. Subscribe to stay informed on the numbers, the laws, and the truth behind the headlines. Stay safe.